Welcome back to Big Mouth and welcome to yet another edition of the dceu Daily. Now, there's no dceu updates for you today, so I thought today I'd try and display the current mediocrity and plagiarism in the entertainment industry, especially focusing on Hollywood, by talking about Justice League and the state of the DC live-action franchise thus far and what's happened. I think Justice League is a great example of the state of this industry right now. Normally the entertainment system is a stacked deck. And what I mean by that is the plagiarism, the lack of imagination. And so, when you look back to Man of Steel, they brought in Christopher Nolan as this godfather figure in this godfather role to develop a DC live action universe, right? Because they liked, I don't know if they necessarily liked what he did with the Dark Knight trilogy. I don't think it's really about that. It's the fact that it made a hell of a lot of money and critics and audiences both loved him. But the problem with that is Nolan didn't want to get his hands dirty with actually directing and writing all of these movies. He wanted to be free to do his own projects, and quite right too. But what's interesting to me is that no one really focuses on this actually, and I noticed this, is that we all noticed that the Man of Steel sequel, Batman vs Superman Dawn of Justice, wasn't a story written by David Goyer and Christopher Nolan. Why is that? Because Man of Steel was deemed by the studio and Kevin Sugihara not to have made the money they wanted it to. It wasn't the success they wanted it to be. Now, that's not me talking. That's not my opinion, because I love Man of Steel, as you freaking well know, right? But the point is, as far as the studio were concerned, it didn't do the business, and it didn't get the love wholeheartedly from the media and the fans that they wanted it to be. And I think there is a debate there to be had. How should, comic book superhero movies be displayed? Should they be frivolous and light-hearted and fun? Or should they be a little bit darker? Should they have something to say, like Man of Steel does, about humanity trying to explore other planets because we fucked up this planet so they can move humanity to other worlds in the stratosphere, right? That's something great to say. Batman vs Superman Dawn of Justice has something to say about how we treat immigrants, how we treat outsiders. That literally is what BVS is saying. Think about it. Think about how Superman is treated, because he's an outsider with power. And this is about racism. This is about immigrants, right? And how they're treated. That's what Batman vs Superman is trying to say. It's about authoritarian governments. It's about what we saw in America for 4 years under Trump, right? And the way they treat people, right? You could say that Lex Luthor, Jesse Eisenberg's Lex Luthor, is Trump manipulating a whole situation. And we see what happens in the Senate building. And then we saw it in the real world mere weeks ago. So BVS and MOS had something to say, but there is a debate to be had. What do people want to see? What do you do as a studio? Do you do what Marvel and Disney and Fake have done, which is make the most entertaining, enjoyable movies you can and not have a depth of story there, not have very interesting villains? Let's be clear here. The DCEU has had better villains than the MCU, but it's not deemed by the mainstream audience to be a success or to be as good as the MCU. That's interesting. In fact, Marvel stans, MCU stans, will tell you that the MCU are the greatest movies ever made, which is insane, isn't it? When you think about the great history Hollywood had in making great movies. But this is where we are today. So under that banner, right, after MOS and BVS, you've got this situation where these are kind of really dark, really gritty, really unique films. And then I think Ang Lee, that's who I want to talk about. Ang Lee did a Hulk movie, didn't he? Many, many years ago. So we've got two visionary directors who have tried to make visionary comic book adaptations on the big screen. So we got Snyder with Man of Steel and BVS, and we got Ang Lee's Hulk. So Ang Lee's Hulk was reviled by the mainstream media and a lot of fans. I loved Ang Lee's Hulk movie. I liked the idea that he was trying to kind of have different shots like a comic book, up there, down there, different panels. It was an amazing visionary take, and Eric Bana gave a brilliant display as Bruce Banner and the Hulk. And by the way, Nick Nolte played a great villain. The story was fantastic. I don't think it was based on a comic book, but it was great. It was brilliant. What happened? He never got a sequel because it didn't make the money, and the so-called mainstream media and mainstream audiences didn't embrace it. But a few of us still hold that film up to something beautiful and unique because it is. As a film. Forget about a superhero film. As a film, it's fantastic, and it treats its subject matter seriously. But you get people like they say about Snyder, it's too serious. They took themselves too seriously. Let's not forget here that a comic book movie, you read a comic book, it's not a sitcom, is it? You know, some are lighter than others, but they're not sitcoms. Well, you know, there's been a misunderstanding here, even with Feig's MCU. Yeah, they've got jokes in there, but they do kind of have some drama in there, and they are trying to create something. You know, Robert Downey Jr.'s Tony Stark is this selfish millionaire making these weapons. And when he's attacked, he works out that his work is being used to hurt billions of people across the world. He stands up and becomes Iron Man. So I think in the early days with Favreau, there was something really bold there. And even the first Captain America, you take a really short, you know, thin, skinny man in Captain America. I forgot what the character's normal name is now. But yeah, you take a young man like that who just wants to sign up, but he can't because of his size. And it's kind of a body shaming kind of story, if you like. It's like he's underestimated as a human because of what he looks like and his size. It's kind of the thing that they always kind of said women can't join up to the army years ago because it was perceived that women weren't physically strong enough to be a soldier. That's been proven wrong in the modern era. Now, a lot of sexists won't agree with me there. So the MCU has had some great important things to say as well, but there's been a miscomprehension about what Feig has actually done. And even Feig was involved with Singer's X-Men. Feig was involved with Raimi's Spider-Man. Feig's always been there in the background. Don't think that he hasn't. And his involvement with Raimi's Spider-Man, you know, I think all three Spider-Man films are really good by Raimi. I know a lot of you won't agree with that. So, there's been this issue lately with visionary directors making comic book movies. So, Ang Lee did something really special with the Hulk. Now, I know loads of fans of those movies who still say to me, I wish we fought as hard as you in the Snyderverse DC fandom to get that vision continued. So it's an interesting situation. So because Snyder, while making Man of Steel, spoke about making films by committee, and he's always said he doesn't like those type of films. And I think that's the conversation him and Chris Nolan had. And, you know, you get a film by committee or a film made by a director. There's two different films, right? And so it's really strange to me if we go back to the disappearance of Goya and Nolan for the story of the Man of Steel sequel, Batman vs. Superman Dawn of Justice. In the credits, and we've discussed this on this channel before, it says, you know, screenplay or story by David Goyer and Chris Terrio. But that's not true. They tore up Goya's Man of Steel 2 sequel, and Terrio was brought in by Affleck, right? So they kind of blamed Goya and Nolan for Man of Steel not making over $1 billion and not being received better by the mainstream audience and access media. So as influential as Nolan was with them, and as much and desperate they wanted to keep him at the studio making his own independent movies, they said, you know what? It hasn't worked. So you asked the question here. If they wasn't happy with Man of Steel and the business that it did and the reaction that it got, how come Snyder kept his job on BVS, but Nolan and Goya were moved aside? If you're a studio, I'm glad this didn't happen because I love Zack's DC movies, as you know. But if you're going to blame Nolan and Goya for the story, why would you keep Snyder? It makes no sense. Well, what they decided to do was to bring in Geoff Johns in the BVS process and try and interfere with what was going on. This is how it all started, right? They thought they brought Johns in as a fixer to kind of police Snyder. But on the other hand, they said to Snyder, this is your movie, continue it, Man of Steel universe, continue your art. He makes his film, he wants it to be a 3-hour movie, they cut half an hour off of it. They don't make him do reshoots, right? But then, to the naked eye, not to me and you, but to the naked eye, that film doesn't make sense once you strip half an hour away from it. It does to me. It's still a great movie once you see the 3-hour Ultimate Edition. That film cannot be, that theatrical 2.5-hour version of BVS cannot be watched anymore because I've tried it when they've put it on the telly or when they've had it on Netflix. So there's that. So they did that. And then when the movie it had a great opening couple of weeks, or a great opening weekend BVS, but then the drop-off was massive because of the reaction from the movie, because it's a pioneering kind of visionary movie, and because people perceive the MCU as this cookie-cutter kind of franchise, everyone's saying everything should be like the MCU. It's like after The Dark Knight, everyone was saying, well, everything should be like The Dark Knight. This is how the industry and movie media work. They don't look at individualism. They don't look at dynamism. They don't look at visionary storytellers. If something works, it should all be like that. This is how Hollywood works. So after the reaction of BVS, what did they do? Zack brought in David Ayer. He made his film, right? Everyone was really proud of David's version of Suicide Squad, including and especially Jared Leto, who would absolutely bore anyone interviewing him about the film. How great the actors were, the crew. David's vision is fantastic. They then told David to rewrite portions of the movie and reshoot it. So again, we're in the same position again. We then got another extended cut of that, but that wasn't Ayer's ultimate vision, but it's more of his vision than the first film that they cut to pieces. So already there was a domino effect there. This is how Hollywood works. Instead of having the common sense to say after Man of Steel, we don't want Goya, we don't want Nolan, and we don't want Snyder. That was the truth. That would have been honesty, right? Because once you allow him to do BVS, what you've got to do is allow him to finish off, shake him by the hand, and then bring Whedon in if you want, right? If they allowed that, Whedon and John's vision, they would have got away with it. Everything would have been fine. And, you could have even said that was Snyder's Justice League cast. We're going to do something different now. It's like the comics. You've got this run of comic book stories, and then you bring a new writer and new artists in, don't you? This is what they could have done here, but no. And so they decided to stick with Snyder, which is a really weird decision, seeing that they weren't happy with the tone of Man of Steel or the reaction or to the box office of Man of Steel, right? Geoff Johns in a Vulture article with Diane Nelson, saying things like, oh, I tried to give my advice and they didn't listen to me, that they can't do these things. So Geoff Johns was very vocal that he didn't approve with what Snyder was doing. This isn't personal. This wasn't personal, right? You've got two passionate figures who love DC, Snyder and Johns. Johns has been working in comics all his life. He sees it a different way to Snyder. That's all. He was brought in, Johns, to police this situation where if you don't approve of what Snyder's doing, if you don't approve of Man of Steel, if you don't approve of the vision of Goya and Nolan, right, you've got to bin everyone, including Snyder. Unfortunately, because we would never have seen BVS, which would have been a great tragedy. But they didn't do that. So then we get to Justice League. After everything they did to Ayer and Snyder already, right, and their visions, they still allowed Snyder to do Justice League. This is insane. Now, we're talking about the old WB regime. That's very important. It's all very different now. Now, we know that Hamada has got connections to that old regime, and there's no question about that, which is somewhat problematic. So he does Justice League, right? They see his initial script. They don't like it. Cut it down. And then they want the movie to be 2 hours. Snyder says, no, I can't do that. I've at least got to make a 2.5 hour movie here. And then they don't like the Steppenwolf design. Then they don't want Superman in a black costume. Now, this is interesting to me. Who was it who didn't want the black costume? Because if it was Jeff Johns, this is a man who's worked on comics. He's worked on Superman. He knows when Superman dies and is revived, he wears the black costume. So what exactly is the problem here? Now, Snyder's idea and vision of the black costume isn't necessarily about it being a power suit that attracts the yellow sun. It's about Kal embracing his Kryptonian heritage and for a time rejecting his human heritage, a bit like what Clark did on Smallville. Very interesting way to go at things. So even though the black suit's not used in exactly the same way as in the death of Superman and the story of Superman Lives, I like it. I think it's great. And if it's a good idea, I don't mind things being changed. And so Snyder was driven off the project. He said, now, don't forget, this is a studio at that time who made this man come out and say that he thought he could carry on with the movie after Autumn's death, but he felt he couldn't any longer. He spoke the truth when he spoke to Sean O'Connell for his book, released the Snyder Cut book, and said it was a battle. It was an ongoing battle. And after the death of my daughter, I couldn't emotionally keep the fight up. Do you really think if they didn't give him a hard time, he couldn't have finished his film? Of course. But if Snyder stayed on, we would have had the same situation again. A 2.5 hour movie cut to pieces by them, and then he would have had to eventually release his 4-hour cut. It still would have been an event, but not like now. So he leaves. And this is where we get the situation of Justice League. Justice League is an example how the industry is run now. Now, we've spoken about making films by committee before. And this is the thing now. The committee actually isn't as much as Hollywood as it used to be. The committee is Twitter and the pundits and the bloggers and the mainstream audience is talking shit all day. The studios are actually on Twitter constantly with burner accounts seeing what people are saying. This is the truth. Everyone. All these important people, and it's not just Hollywood producers and directors. There's people who make Doctor Who. There's everyone, right? They're there spying to see what people are saying. The problem is with that, you're not necessarily dealing with the masses. There could be a silent majority who are not on social media. This is when things get problematic. So they forced Snyder off the project. They brought Whedon in. And they say to Whedon the most ridiculous thing, that you have to rewrite elements. You have to take all the darker stuff out, put funny stuff, put jokes in, brighter colours. Oh, and by the way, you've only got till the original release date, which was November, right? So they said and I'm assuming when he came back and said, well, that's impossible. I can't make a good film in that time. And they said, well, you won't get Batgirl then. That's the kind of carrot they were dangling at him, as we all know. So he does it. And it's awful and it's horrible and it's embarrassing. Justice League is an embarrassing, you can't even call it a film. Justice League is terrible because they rushed the man. He was under pressure. He was taking it out on his crew and cast, and this is what went wrong. This is the core piece that went wrong. And this is why the Ray Fisher investigation, as we're calling it, happened. Because the modern Hollywood kind of, model of how to make a film has changed. It's all about what's said on Twitter, what's said on social media, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And what's not acceptable, or what wasn't acceptable, was a visionary director having something to say about these superhero universes, about a visionary director bringing superheroes, fictional characters from fantasy worlds into the real world and having these superheroes say something about the real world. It didn't go down well, even though Nolan did it with Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, and The Dark Knight Rises. He did it with those films. and it was acceptable. But because the DCEU started with Superman, I think I'm going to sneeze, by the way, so bear with me, but I hope I don't sneeze. But so it was acceptable when Nolan did it, but Superman is a different animal. Firstly, a lot of people hated Snyder over Watchmen, so that reputation followed him onto the DCEU. So the toxicity towards the man was there. But it's just an example of how modern day Hollywood works. It works in a vacuum. So, and Justice League is a fine example of where we are in the entertainment industry, where they removed the man, right? They removed his Steppenwolf, which is glorious and frightening, right? And they gave us Whedon's version of Steppenwolf, which is a guy in a helmet, basically, with white makeup. That's who he is. He looks like a fucking circus. He looks like Sideshow Bob, right? It is embarrassing. I'm a big Sideshow Bob. I'm a big Simpsons fan and Family Guy fan, by the way. But they thought that version of Steppenwolf was better than what Zack gave us because they didn't want a scary, dark villain. They wanted Sideshow Bob. And it was ridiculous. And it was embarrassing. Because Whedon had got himself in a situation where he was signed up and he couldn't escape, and he wanted Batgirl. So we had this awful film. And don't forget, it's not just embarrassing for the industry and Warner Brothers that film was ever released. We made that film because we all went to see it at least once. We made that film nearly 700 million globally, which is deemed to be a flop. But if that was a solo movie and they spent less money on it, like Joker movie made $1 billion, right? But nearly 700 million at the global box office for an embarrassing piece of art is an astronomical amount of money. So it also says something about us, the audience, that we were sucked in, that we didn't see any problems when Zack made his statement why he would moved on. But then Whedon came in. Then he brought in his own composer in. And nobody really smelled many rats. And even if you did smell the rat, and I've said yesterday how I felt about it. I felt that Joss Whedon, he's done all this stuff. Maybe this is the best thing for now, right? I was mistaken. I was wrong. But I knew what they were doing. I understood what was going on, that Zack had been removed and they wanted to go down a new avenue. And maybe if Whedon and Johns were allowed to do their own film with their own cast, with their own DC universe, maybe it would have worked. But it wasn't going to work while, grabbing somebody else's work and mismashing it with your own vision. That never works. But because of greed, because of money, because of shareholders wanting to get their money. And in the end, they didn't get anything because the film was an absolute fucking disaster. But only in Hollywood could you get a disaster like Justice League, but you move on. You move on to Aquaman, which makes $1 billion at the global box office. Over. Quite well reviewed, although not by everyone. The fans loved it. I loved Aquaman. I think Aquaman's a great movie. I think Snyder's vision for Aquaman, the film, with Batman and Superman being in it, would have been even better. But of course, because of Justice League flopped, they put a narrative out there that we're not really interested in the shared universe anymore. We're going to make self-contained movies. That was the tag. Self-contained movies. So, and this goes back to Wonder Woman 2017. Do you really think if Zack was free after BVS to do what he wanted, that Batfleck wouldn't have been in Wonder Woman 2017 instead of a fucking Wayne Enterprises truck and an email from Bruce Wayne? Do you think Batfleck wouldn't have been there in the flesh as he was in Suicide Squad? Of course he would have at the end of the film. Maybe they would have been there talking together at the museum in between the flashbacks and it would have been awesome. But no, we didn't do that. Again, we went down this self-contained route. Now don't forget Wonder Woman 2017 is the final fucking movie before we see Justice League. So it would have made sense at the end there for Bruce to come in and say, Diana, I need you now. I need your help. I know you've been in hiding all these years. And that's another thing. This whole thing about, how Wonder Woman was hiding for all those years. She turned her back on mankind. It's a great beat. You know why that's a great beat? Because in Justice League, she would have stood up with the League to fight Steppenwolf and later Darkseid. In the other movies, It shows you a step of evolution for the character. But this studio and Patty Jenkins saw it differently. They saw that statement as so un-Wonder Woman, that Wonder Woman would never do this. If a character has seen 1,000 years of horrors, or whatever she says at the end of BBS at the graveyard there, right? And she's lost all faith in the people she came to protect. It's a good story because ultimately she comes out of that story. But this is where these people don't understand comics. They say Snyder doesn't understand the DC comic universe. I think it's them who refuse to understand the actual world. But forget about the comic book world. This is what we learn at film school. This is what you learn about how to take characters' evolutions step by step. And there's lots of many ways you can do that. And one of the steps is that the character starts here and they evolve and they stand up in the end and they become a hero. It's simple. So when you see a pilot of something, the character isn't in the place he or she's going to be in mid-season of season 1. It's obvious. Without having an evolution, it's not interesting. Batwoman isn't an interesting show because the original character played by Ruby Rose doesn't have an evolution. And they're trying to give this new character more of an evolution. I'm not watching that show every week, by the way. But we're not talking about Batwoman here. And so they refuse to understand. So what you've got with the DCEU now, and this is what I'm trying to show you where the entertainment industry is today. They've sacrificed the art of filmmaking and said, well, superheroes are popular. Let's just make superhero blockbusters. They don't care about the indie films anymore, only when it suits them and only when it suits their representation guidelines. But they don't care about independent movies anymore. They don't care about independent directors anymore. They don't care about, visionary filmmakers like they did in the late 60s, 70s and 80s. Then we had visionary filmmakers making visionary films. And people like Spielberg were making Jaws and producing Back to the Future and Jurassic Park. And, Jurassic Park is visionary within itself. And it has something to say, that first film, about cloning and the consequences of cloning, doesn't it? Even that film had something to say, right? Unfortunately, we're saying the wrong things in our films now. So this is the thing here. And so what happens after Justice League is they try and bury the evidence. And then, the fans and Snyder and Fiona are leaking out scenes here and there. But they're trying to hide. They're trying not to admit there's a Snyder cut, right? It's obvious there's a Snyder cut because we saw a fucking video, released and approved by Warner Brothers of Snyder thanking everyone in London, the crew in London, for a great shoot and his completed principal photography. We know that Snyder filmed a fucking movie. We know that Snyder filmed his movie. We know that. It's obvious. It's not a finished movie. Of course not. It's just there in it's got to be edited. It needs the VFX right. We knew that. So the argument that they were getting their journalists in Access Media to say is that there's no Snyder cut, there's no completed movie. Well, we fucking know it wasn't a completed movie. You didn't give the guy a chance to fucking complete it. So we're not idiots. And we're not idiots, but this is how... And then you get that whole Wall Street Journal with Ben Fritz. And it was obvious to the most idiotic cretin in the world that was a hit piece. And they used fans from the Snyderverse. This is how much we were getting to them. We were exposing them. And they didn't like it because they knew people were starting to take notice. So they tried to shoot that down. And they nearly did. But Snyder fought back. So unlike Ann Lee, who didn't even get a chance of a second movie, Snyder was the first time in the history of film fought back against the Hollywood machine by integrating people like Fiona, by leaking things at first, then setting up the Vero account, then ingratiating the fans and showing them what would have been. I've said before on this channel, Snyder's very smart about saying, well, this is what I would have done. I would have had Darkseid. I would have had this. I would have had that. I would have had Superman in black suit. He's luring you in with things that you want to see that he was going to give you. So he's a very smart man. So for the first time in Hollywood, the machine was defeated. And believe you me, the machine doesn't like the Snyderverse fandom or Snyder, because for the first time, a town that's in a bubble, Tinseltown, a town that literally has its own police force, right, in California, that's pretty much just there to protect them, right? A town that's so corrupt, that lives in its own bubble, that can do whatever the fuck it wants, for the first time was defeated by one visionary director and a group of ordinary working class people without a pot to piss in. And they are pissed off. So how did they lose? They lost because a major corporation bought Time Warner and said the customer is right and we're going to put it out there. Because AT&T are outside of the Hollywood bubble. They're just a company that acquired another company and said, do you know what? We're going to do this because we know it's going to make us money and we like these people and we like this creative and we think it's the right thing to do. And AT&T, and that's their business model and that's their monologue, that the customer is always right. As I said previously, I think, in yesterday's edition of the dceu Daily. So all of a sudden, you've got AT&T not playing by their rules. Now, we saw people like Nolan and other directors' reaction to AT&T, Jason Kilar and Ann Sarnoff deciding to break the movie release window by releasing it via HBO Max and cinemas were open. Did you see the ferocity? Nolan even citing Jason Kilar as someone who doesn't understand the industry and doesn't know his job, and which is amazing when you see the man's CV and what he's done at other streaming services like Hulu. So to say that the man doesn't know what he's doing and he's bad at his job and he doesn't understand, and it's, as I said before when I was reacting to Nolan's outburst about the release window changing, when people say they don't know how it works here, it's like when you move to a small town and they tell you have to wear a blue suit, and if you don't, they beat you up over the head with a club, right? And so this is what they mean. They said, well, it doesn't work like that here. We set the rules, not you. Now the rules are broken. And there's still entities at WB Pictures, but the problem that are against AT&T and Kilar and Sarnoff, but the problem is they're not going to survive the process. Because, as I've said to you before, Stanky's calling the shots. And so no decisions have been made about the future of the Snyderverse. But that's going to be the almighty victory here. Because this film is going to make so much money, I believe it's going to turn some people around to Snyder's side. And I keep on seeing on social media, especially Twitter, all the time, that we will get more. And that my confidence level is there. There is no question when you look at the trailer views and the reaction to that trailer, that the actual film isn't going to stream successfully. Of course it is. And then the company is there. And more people want to see more, and they will see more. And don't think if the Snyderverse is kind of restored, and we see the restoration of the Snyderverse of the DCEU, that won't affect what they're doing centrally. But the multiverse strategy is a good idea, even with Snyder in play, because it means he's got his Elseworld. Now, I don't know how all this is going to work. And as we spoke about Cavill yesterday, very, very complicated to bring him back with his history with WB Pictures. So when you look at the DC Extended Universe, it's started one way. They tried to police and rebuild what they wanted to do with it. It failed. And their old foe, Snyder, is back in a very big way. Because we know that Army of the Dead with Netflix, written and directed by Zack Snyder, will have its trailer on Thursday, released on May sometime, and Snyder's going to own 2021. And this is a problem to his enemies. And this is exactly what would have happened with Ang Lee over at Marvel if he kept on getting movies for the whole... If let's just say there was an MCU and he ran it for years and years, they would have gone against Ang Lee. They hated Ang Lee over at Marvel for what he did. But as I said at the beginning of the video, the top of the show, that Ang Lee is a visionary pioneer. He's had critical acclaim for all his films, apart from the Hulk movie. Why? Why aren't people allowed to have a visionary take on superheroes? Why is it allowed on everything else but superhero movies? And as I said to you, this is the thing. This is the thing. This is the conversation. What are the rules here? That they should just be light, fluffy and funny and bright colours? Or is there an avenue? Or is there a place where in a corner of a universe you can have an Ang Lee, you can have a Zack Snyder? I think so. But people in this community, in Hollywood and in the comic community, don't like these people and try and drive them out. Now, they succeeded in driving Ang Lee out, and Ang Lee was very magnanimous and kept his mouth shut so he could continue to work in the industry. Now, Snyder was sidelined for quite a time, but as I just mentioned, Army of the Dead, Netflix went out to bat for him and said, you know what? We want you with us here. Do it. And he's not just doing Army of the Dead. He's doing an animated prequel spin-off. He's going to do other things with Army of the Dead. He's creating his own universe there. And so all of a sudden, Snyder is reborn. Basically, they couldn't beat him because he had an army behind him. Us, the fans who saw something that, like me, said, yes, this is nothing like the comics I read as a boy. This is nothing like the Reeve and Donner era that I grew up loving. This is nothing like Smallville. This is nothing like anything we've seen before. This is a man's visionary take on these DC characters, and that's totally fine. And it really speaks about the modern era that we live in, the world we live in, Snyder's DC stories and this arc. And so why shouldn't that be allowed as long as we can have mainstream movies out there as well alongside them that don't have to connect? And this multiverse strategy can absolutely do that. There is going to be no choice but to allow the Snyderverse to continue. But I just thought I'd do a video today with not much news out there to explain to you the state of this industry and how they try and quash anything that's different and unique and visionary. This is what they're like. They tried to quash Snyder and it didn't work. They tried to do Justice League and it was an absolute disaster. They thought they could put an unpolished film out there, beyond unpolished, and get away with it. But the problem is, the power when the Snyder Cut was announced as being greenlit on HBO Max, a lot of Access Media was speaking for Hollywood in general, saying we don't think a group of fans should be able to decide what gets shown and what doesn't. In other words, we don't think people should have the rights to decide what they see, because that's always been the Hollywood way, right? But this one time, that changed. But it wasn't a one-time thing, because what's going on with Snyder and the Snyder Cut fandom has changed everything. It's changed the world of entertainment. We've seen the elite army fighting for more elite films with very little success. What happened with Snyder is unique, because Snyder is unique because he was intelligent enough to kind of basically arm us with the information and corruption that went on. How do you think all the Snyderverse fans keep on going on about Johns and Toby and all of this? How do they know this? Who's leaked this information? Snyder, because he's smart. And this is why he's basically got his role back in Hollywood. He's a little man on his own, making his visionary movies. They don't like him. But here's the thing. Hollywood isn't a family. They don't sit by the table anyway. They don't have to approve of him. I remember the director of Logan, a film I absolutely love, going onto Twitter and saying, why you lot won't let Zack Snyder move on, blah, blah, blah. And I asked him on Twitter, Mangold, isn't it? That's it, Mangold. And I asked him, I said, do you actually know Zack Snyder? Have you ever met him? He said, no. Then he blocked me. And this is how these people work. Because if you notice, I'm on Twitter at Movies TV Mad. If you notice the way I talk to these people on Twitter, I'm not toxic. I have a certain way of talking because I know how they work. I know how their minds work. I know how this industry works. Now, very important, you never judge people with little subscribers and not being a successful superstar on social media. Doesn't mean I'm not connected. It doesn't mean I don't mix in famous circles. It doesn't mean I don't know this one and that one. It's just that I don't brag about it. because I'm not a bragger. Because I think you should be friends with people because of who they are, not what they've achieved and what they represent. And, you know, I don't have to elevate myself by who I know. I believe that in my heart, I'm superior to most people, and that's my arrogance and that's my ego. But anyway, I thought I would just try and show you the state of Hollywood today and how they try and drown out any independent voices. It's always been a stacked system, boys and girls, and everybody else. But the Snyderverse fandom and Zack Snyder got that stacked deck and ripped it to shreds. And now the atmosphere and the arena has changed forever. Comment down below, like, share and subscribe. And of course, I'll be back tomorrow with even more DCEU Daily. And don't forget, I'll be on Twitter all throughout the day at Movies TV Mad. Give me a follow. See you again soon.